Hey guys, and welcome back to the Bits of Good Bootcamp. Right now we're going to talk about lists and keys inside of React. So before we get into the details, let's just go over a little bit of just regular JavaScript. And this should look familiar. The map function is something that you should have already learned by this point. But just as a quick review, what it does is it takes every entry in myArray and applies the callback function that you specify here to each element of the array, and then it actually returns a new array with the results of the callback function. So if you have an array of size n, it's going to essentially take every element of the array, run it through the callback function, and whatever the callback function returns is going to be put into this result array, and it's also going to be an array of size n. So this is a very, very, very useful tool in React, as we're going to start to see. It allows us to transform arrays of data. For example, if you had like a list of users that you were getting from your backend, you can use the map function to transform that list of just data into components that you can then display on your in your React application. So something that's really useful for sure. Now, when we're talking about rendering multiple components, right? So let's see how we can start doing that in React. So this is, like I said, we're going to be using the map function, and here you see we have a list of numbers. So like this could be any kind of data. Right here we have all integers or numbers, but this could also be objects. It doesn't really matter. And so we're taking this list of numbers and we're going to print it out in an unordered list. So this is something, if you had like a list of social media posts, for example, you might want to also like print these out into a list. So you see what we're doing here is we're just running it through numbers.map, and then we're getting the current numbers. So this will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 respectively. And then we're going to return a new component. And then, so inside of list items, what we're going to have is an array that has 5 distinct components, or elements here, sorry, that have the numbers inside of an li tag. So let's go ahead and just kind of see an example of this so you can convince yourself that this is working, as I've told you. Okay, it's running. Okay, here we go. So we have our list, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we are getting our ULs. Our UL is showing us all the li components, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is pretty much what we expected. And note that we're actually getting this error warning: each child in an array or iterator should have a unique key. And then it gives us a link for more information. And it says check the top level render call using UL in li. So we'll come back to this, but this is definitely a warning that we want to take care of. And we'll learn a little bit more about that in a second here. So here what we've also done is we've actually created a component. Normally, if you have a bunch of data that you want to display in a list, the easiest way to do that is just to create a component whose job it is to display a list of data. And so here we've encapsulated that functionality that we just had inside of a component. So you see we have numbers list, and it's receiving a prop called numbers, which is our familiar numbers array. And then inside of numbers list, it's going ahead and doing the exact same thing that we saw before of printing it out. And so I'm not going to actually click on this because it's basically the same thing that we just saw before. It's just inside of a component this time. So let's talk about actually fixing that error we saw before. And all you need to do is assign a key to each li inside of our list. So this one I do want to show you just to prove to you that this does fix our error. Or sorry, it was a warning. Okay, so we see here we have our numbers list. So this was the component that we are using to encapsulate the whole list making. And then here we have our familiar list items variable, which is being stored, or which is being filled with the result of numbers.map, where numbers.map, the callback function, is creating a li element and then storing that into list items here. And so here you see that we added this keys is equal to numbers.toString. So all this is doing is it's taking the number that we're being passed into inside of this map function, and then it's calling the toString method to make that a string, and it's assigning the key to that. So each li now is going to have a key, and you see our error went away. And so if we just go ahead here, just for the sake of testing things out, if I delete this, once this code reruns, we're going to see that that error comes back. So that should convince you that this is very necessary in order to be able to use React effectively. Okay, let's keep on learning some more about keys though. Oops. Sorry. Keys. So keys help React know when items have changed, are added, or are removed. So essentially, keys are how React is able to identify all these li items from each other, because to React, it gets kind of confusing when it sees that you have a bunch of LIs that are rendered at the same time at the same level. It doesn't really know how to identify individual LI components from each other, and because of that, it has a hard time when it's trying to monitor for changes. And remember, React tries to be really smart and only re-render the parts of the DOM that have been changed. And so without the key component, it has a really hard time of knowing what specific LIs or adjacent identical elements have in fact changed. And so essentially, a little rule of thumb that you should remember: whenever you're using some kind of map function inside of React to generate elements, that should be a pretty strong indicator that you need to be using keys. So here, I'm using todos.map. This is a case where I need to have keys. And then it's also really important to know that keys have to be unique, because like I said, React is using the keys in order to be able to distinguish identical elements, essentially identical elements, from each other. And so if the keys aren't unique, then it's going to be confused again. It's going to be in the same situation before we added the keys, where it can't tell two things apart. So this is why it's really important for them to be unique. And typically, we don't really want to use indexes for keys, because these aren't very unique in terms of, if the list order changes, like, this isn't going to distinguish this specific to-do. It's just going to distinguish this to-do's place in the list. So whenever you have a list that is subject to changes in order, you probably shouldn't use order as a way to identify, or you shouldn't use index as a way to identify the keys. And so here, this link kind of goes into more detail about keys and when you should be using it and the importance of using it. I'm going to leave this in the PowerPoint in case you want to go back later, but it should suffice it to say, just use a key and make sure that the key is unique. Well, let's keep talking about some more examples. So sometimes we might want to extract away some stuff into a component, but in this case, it's still really important to use keys properly. So back to the example of a to-do list, or a numbers list actually. Let's say that instead of just having our numbers list render a bunch of LIs, we're actually going to create a whole new component, which we're calling list item, and that's going to take the key, that's going to take the job of actually rendering a value inside of an LI. And so when we're doing numbers.map, we're really just returning a bunch of list items. And so here you can see incorrectly in this example that they have decided to put the key inside this LI, which is now inside this list item. So if you consider the order of components here, we have numbers list, which is essentially at the top level, where my red is, like, this is just abstract. And then numbers list is rendering an array of list items. And then each list item then in the third level down actually has an LI. But these LIs the keys being on the LIs are not correct. In fact, what we should be doing is we should be putting the keys at the list item, because that's what's now being rendered inside of this map function. If you recall our rule of thumb, whenever you're using a map function is essentially when you need to be using a key. And here, inside of list item, we're not actually using a map function inside of list item, but we are using a map function inside of number list when we're generating all these list items. So that's why we need to have the key on list item. So here we'll have the corrected example where this is showing the proper usage of keys. And so you see, like I told you before, the key is attached to list item as opposed to the LI in this case, because the list item is what is being returned from this map function. Let's just take a second here and look at this code pen and make sure that this is accurate, like I said. Okay, it's loading. All right, perfect. So here now we see that we, in fact, are not getting any errors or warnings in the console. And if I take this key and I remove that from list item, we're going to start getting that warning again. And if I put the key inside of LI, we're still going to get that warning. Actually, we're getting an error even. I think it's because I didn't use the right prop. It should actually be props.value. But we'll still be getting the warning about the keys. And that's because the key needs to be here. So key here will be equal to number.toString. And now we'll see that this should go away if I clear the console. Here we go. Now it's rendering properly because the key is here. And I'll just remove this so this doesn't get confusing. All right, let's get back to the slides. Let's leave that page. All right, let's continue. Remember again the rule of thumb. Anytime you are creating elements inside of a map in JSX, you need to be using keys. This is the rule of thumb that I'm pounding into your head in this video. Please, please, please remember. This is going to have a big effect on your React performance, and sometimes your React components won't even behave as you're expecting if you don't include keys. So it's not just a matter of performance, it's actually a matter of functionality as well. And like I said before, keys have to be unique, but they actually only have to be unique within their siblings. So what this means is that it's okay to use the same keys inside of different arrays. So for this example, we have a blog, and so we have a bunch of posts in our blog, and so each post has an ID, but we're actually using the posts in two different places. We have two .map functions going on. One is here in the content, so this variable here is storing a list, you can see here, of this size with h3 and p tags. And then we have another thing here that's just a sidebar, and this is just a LIs inside of an unordered list. And it's okay to use the same IDs. You see here we're both using post ID and post ID. So inside of content, we're going to have a list of divs that each have an ID that's coming, or sorry, they each have a key that's coming from post ID. And then we're going to have a list of LIs over here in sidebar where the key is also coming from post ID, but this is totally okay because they are in different elements. Like, they are completely separate from each other. What's happening over here, those keys are not going to collide with the keys that are over here. Now, if we had decided to make each key inside of content equal to 0, for example, now this would be a problem because those keys would not be unique. Let's take a look here just to make sure we're not getting any errors. Loading, perfect. We're seeing that we have the same two posts, so the posts here are hello world and installation, and they're not generating any errors because although we're using the same format to get the key value, it's in two different places inside of our React component, two different map functions, and so we're not having any collisions. Now, for example, like I told you though, if I made all these keys 0, so here they're not going to be unique anymore, we're going to start having problems. Put this back, post ID. And then I'll clear this console, make sure. Okay, almost done. Stay with me. So finally, one thing that it's really important to realize is that keys are not actually the same as props. So typically, when we're doing things like this inside of a component and we're adding these like value equal sign curly brackets or value equal signs quotes and then a value inside, those things are being passed in as props. But actually, key is a special word that React is listening for, and it's not actually going to pass that in as a prop. That's only for React. That's something special for the actual library itself, not for our components. And so in this example, the post component, it's going to be able to read ID and title with no problem as props, but it won't be able to get props.key. This is going to be undefined. It's not going to work. So if for some reason the value that you're passing in as a key is something that's important to the component that it needs to use, you need to make sure that you pass that in as a prop with a different name other than key, in addition to key. So yeah, that's an important takeaway as well. And then finally, there's one more thing, I promise, final thing that I want to point out. So far, we've actually been creating a variable and storing all of our results from our map function in that. And then we've been putting the variable inside of curly brackets, and then that's how it's being rendered in the actual JSX down here at the bottom, right? So you should remember from before, though, when we talked about JSX, that JSX can actually accept any valid expression inside of curly brackets. And in fact, a map function here like this, array like numbers.map, is a valid expression. And so what we can actually do is go ahead and plop that directly in the curly brackets and remove the need for that intermediary variable that's temporarily storing those elements that are coming from the numbers.map. Now this is something that's pretty cool. I really like this, but it's also worth noting that this doesn't necessarily mean that you should do this every single time. Whenever we're doing something like this, when we're inlining some logic, it makes it a little bit less readable, although it makes it shorter and more concise. So it's really up to the developer to decide if it's worth it to extract a variable up here. So like we were doing here, we're extracting a variable. It's up to the developer to decide if this is the better approach or if this is the better approach, if it's okay to inline it. And that really just comes down to the readability of the code, how complex is the stuff that's going on, and in some cases, if there's a lot of complex logic, this should probably just be broken up into its own component. Okay, that's it. Thanks for sticking around and listening to the talk here about lists and keys in React. See you in the next video.